Good afternoon, Evan, and welcome to the Humanist Prism video series. Just to let our viewers know, you are the Executive Director of Atheists United, which is a recently joined member of Humanist International, and I think you're also the Chair of the Secular Student Alliance, is that right?
Yeah, Chair of the Board of the Secular Student Alliance.
Excellent, excellent. So perhaps maybe we could start off by maybe just you giving us a bit of information about your background in that position, a bit about Atheists United, and kind of the work that you do there in California.
Great, wonderful. Yeah, I came up into this work and this world of humanist and atheist activism through the Secular Student Alliance. I founded a group at California Lutheran University, one of the religious universities across the United States. And I didn't realize it at the time, but I'd started the first active Secular Student Alliance on a religious college campus,
That's interesting.
which was a blast. And that immediately kind of perked up the staff and a few donors and supporters of the Secular Student Alliance. So I started getting more involved with their work nationally. And then by my senior year, I was elected student body president at Cal Lutheran, which kind of sprung-boarded me into this world. They were very excited because their first student leader to become student body president happened to be at a religious university.
Wow.
And that kind of sprung-boarded me into this world of separation of church and state activism in the United States and a lot of atheist and humanist community organizing, which is what I do today. And I had the honor of getting on the Secular Student Alliance board right after college, and I've been doing that for 8 years now. I think I just broke the record as their longest serving board member. They really need to replace me. This is the moral of the story. But yeah, I bounced around and worked in politics and did my own community organizing over the past 8 to 10 years. And then January of 2019, I got hired as the first executive director of Atheists United in Los Angeles. And Atheists United is a atheist community organization that was founded in 1982. It broke off from American Atheists back in the day. It's got an odd, complicated history. But it's really been kind of the central and most organized atheist group probably in Southern California, in Los Angeles specifically. And from there, there's been a bunch of groups that have taken off over the past 38 years that it's been in existence, but it's still the largest atheist membership organization in the state of California. So we're big and active and one of the only with staff in the country that functions locally.
That's excellent. And I was having a look, maybe if I can share this page actually. I was having a look on your website just before we started, and it's a very interesting set of programs and activities that's going on. Which
it's our brand new website, so I'm glad you're showing it off. We just,
it's really nice.
Just finished this about a month ago. Yeah, we have, what I really love about our programs specifically is we have a meetup network of almost 20 meetups. So if you go to the programs tab and then click meetups, we have a bunch of local community meetups of different stripes and styles. Atheists United is a Spanish-speaking meetup group, for instance.
That's cool.
We have Sunday brunches in different parts of the city. We have a charitable network, Latino group. We have all of these kind of affinity or lifestyle-focused or locality-focused groups. And most of them gather and organize independently, and we support them in different ways and bring them into a larger network. And it's incredible actually hosting this kind of network of 20 different stylized groups for communities to organize around greater Los Angeles, Southern California.
Yeah, that's amazing. And it's interesting as well because if you think, I think you said something about local organizers earlier, and thinking about Los Angeles or California, for me as a British person or even as a European, California's how many millions of
like
people?
40 or so.
Yeah. So that's not far off Britain in terms of population size. So it's always interesting to put it into perspective and realize,
it's odd to remember we're always larger than Canada. In just this
Is that
one
right
state.
in terms of population?
Yeah, I believe we're like neck and neck or a little bit larger. Wow. And definitely, if you're talking money and resources, we put them in the in the dust
Yeah.
behind us. But yeah, it's really, I think community organizing in this space is probably the most interesting kind of social question, I think, of the next 100 years. Churches have dominated the non-governmental spaces of the world for so long. And I remember I was talking to, I was at some really odd business conference in LA that somebody snuck me into. And I was talking to one of those Google X people. These are the people that do the moonshots, and they work on the self-driving cars and the whatever hidden projects Google's working on. And I quickly tried to describe what I do, and he just said, oh, that's $1 trillion industry.
Yeah.
And it was such a fascinating, like, right. I work in this world where, if you think of religion as an industry, it has unbelievable amounts of resources. It has thousands, if not millions, of staff and volunteers around the world. It is touching people's lives almost daily. And we are the entrepreneurs of what the secular, humanist, atheist versions of those might look like if religion isn't going to hold the same status in the future of our societies. And so while America hasn't quite reached the secular levels of a lot of European countries, we do have a lot of well-organized communities and resources being put towards those. But we're still figuring out the model. I think that's a really interesting question is, are we going to replicate churches? Are we going to use other community organizing models? Do we function more politically or less politically? So sometimes I really look at my job as kind of entrepreneurial. I feel like I'm in a startup world and a new industry, and we're trying to solve this problem of how do people organize and what are their needs and how do we address those, but from a secular and humanist perspective. The demographics in the United States, at least, have been transitioning radically fast over the past 20 years. We've seen this massive spike in people identifying less and less with religion. Even atheist and agnostic identification is now close to 10% in the United States, which is unbelievable when you think about 300 plus million people. I mean, we have 20 to 40 million Americans walking around with atheist and agnostic identity, and yet there's not community institutions for them. There's not community service opportunities that function well with their identities. There's not places they can raise their kids necessarily that feel connected to their values. And so regardless of ultimately where our activism leads, there's definitely community needs. And we have to solve these problems. And me being one of the only paid people in the world that does this, I think that's just such an interesting question. Like, I don't have the answers. I mean, I'm not trained. I didn't go to seminary. If I was a religious leader, I would have started by a bunch of years in seminary. I'd go into a larger institution that would place me. I'd be mentored by someone who's been doing this for 40 years. I'd have all these institutional donors. I would have buildings. I would have more leadership retreats and resources. And so many of us right now that are doing community organizing locally, we are learning on the fly. And I think there's this kind of generation of us right now, the next 50 years of leaders who are kind of, I don't know, the entrepreneurs, the pioneers, the trailblazers that are going to figure out some of the foundational elements of what's needed. And some are coming from religious backgrounds. Some are coming from completely secular backgrounds. We're trying more religious models. We're trying more secular models. And I don't know the answer, and I honestly don't care ultimately. I just want us to figure out some solutions. It's a fascinating kind of social problem. And it's fun to be on the kind of leading edge of what might come.
And it's interesting to hear what you say about the demographics in the US, because I think for just to take a European perspective, it's always looked kind of odd to, I say us Europeans, I don't know if it's the same view, but for a country which is as economically prosperous as the United States to have such a high GDP, in Europe that went hand in hand with a decline in or rise in secularism and a decline in religiosity, and the United States has kind of held on to its higher levels of religiosity in a way which, if you took Europe as a case study, wouldn't have been expected.
I've heard different theories on why that might have been. One is possibly how religiously diverse we are in the United States. There's an argument that kind of how well Protestantism stuck in the United States, and it led to thousands of different types of Christianity that sometimes when people questioned or broke off from their original tradition or belief structure, they just like move one over and then one over. And there's a kind of endless loop of different things you can try. I think to some extent, there's an argument that we're more rural and people have had to rely more on the community institutions that they're part of, especially rurally. If we look at the secular and the kind of liberal versus conservative divide we have in the United States, you can't ignore the metropolitan areas versus rural America. There's a huge divide there. And some people never quite escape that rural America. And then I really wonder about some other possibly economic and political things that have happened over the past, I guess we're short life of a country, 200 some odd years. But I think our reaction to the Cold War has a lot of impact on American culture and society. We kind of doubled down on religious presence in our media during that time. Many people might know this already, but the national motto of the United States got changed in the, I believe, 1950s, might have been 60s. I hate that I can't remember the year. It got changed to "In God We Trust." And it wasn't always that way. We actually had quite a secular founding and were the inspiration for a lot of secular laws around the world. But this language and these institutions of religion basically started to gain a lot of power and influence, and even change the motto of the country. Our Pledge of Allegiance, which is kind of something school children do to the flag, just kind of weird and awkward, but they added "under God" into that phrase back in the 50s or 60s. And these now are just part of American culture, and people don't question them. And we forget that there was kind of an organized movement in the 50s and 60s, which has turned into the religious right of today, trying to keep young people and the broader culture thinking of us as more religious, more Christian. And it's fascinating how that's evolved into evangelical Christianity of today.
Yes.
So yeah, I don't know exactly the answer. I'm sure there's some researchers that could give much better answers than I can, but these are some of the theories that I've heard floating around for why we have stayed more religious than other countries of similar wealth and progress.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense, I guess. Those theories.
I've heard the joke that, let's say you're in Italy and you stop being Catholic, like there's not, you're
That's
like
it.
Catholic or you're atheist. You're like kind of done. There's not like a million other Protestant choices. You don't throw a rock and hit a Baptist church or an evangelicalist or a non-denominational. You just kind of like stop being Catholic. I guess I'm not religious.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, part of the first argument of, we have so many choices. And today we're finding in places like California, people move to astrology and vortexes, and
is this the spiritual but not religious category?
There's a lot of woo, we call it. Yeah, there's a lot of woo and spiritual beliefs that seem to be thriving. And that's interesting. I think that's fascinating to see if long term, if I could look at our world 200 years from now, if there is something more innate in the human consciousness that wants to have answers and explanations for the inexplainable, and they will always latch on to some concept of greater than them, or some concept of interconnected planner, and if that will be a belief in faith healers and woo and psychics, or if we can just be like most humanists I know, which is like very content with, this is my one life, and we are the space rocks of today.
Yes, yeah. It's interesting. I heard, I think it was Stephen Fry, who on one of these debates made an interesting point or an interesting suggestion, and he said that part of the irony about the situation with the religiosity decline in Europe and the kind of stability in the United States was, we, in many countries, most countries in Europe, had institutional churches, so I'm in London right now, so we have the Church of England, which is the national church, which is
right.
It's a weird
so
thing.
Awkward.
It's very, very odd, so We have a House of Lords, which is part of the Parliament, a legislature, which is
awkward.
bizarre, and there's bishops in that of the national church.
Right.
And the national church has its own courts, it has its own laws, it has its own. I think in the context of the United States, it would be a branch of government essentially.
Right. Yeah,
which
and
is crazy, obviously.
had that. Yeah.
But I think one of the arguments that I think it was Stephen Fry or somebody put forward was actually what that's done is it's tempered our religion, because the Church of England and, say, the Danish Church, in order to continue getting state funding and having its prominent role with the government, it had to some extent follow public opinion on things like equality, gay marriage, blah blah blah. And so that actually was like a sort of anchor that pulled the religious views into a more progressive direction. Which, if you think about it, it does sound kind of odd, because we all have this idea, well, I think a lot of us share this idea, that American secularism, the separation of church and state, in that very kind of formalized legal way, is a better situation than what we have in the UK, which is a kind of muddle of church and state and so on. But I wonder if there's an issue there, maybe.
No, I think legally it's held up very well in the United States over time. I think what we're realizing right now is kind of the weakness possibly of our systems to hold up. And while we thought that was this wall that will always stand strong against anything, actually a well-organized campaign against it can be quite effective. Even got me thinking about the legal structure of the United States itself, where we give a lot of power to the states. And so each state is kind of this experimental place, and some of those states are far more religious and conservative, and so they've chipped away at them in different ways. So education programs in the United States, for instance, we're famous for having debates about evolution in our classrooms, and that came from a few states refusing to teach evolution the way it is understood in science. And there became this conflict, and the federal government didn't step in the way it was needed in most cases. And so sometimes the federal government leaves a lot to the states, and then the states, if there's a religious majority that is strong enough and politically organized, can have a lot of influence over people's lives. America, in my mind, has always been this strange confluence of some of the most pioneering and liberal and expressive leaders and educators in the world, and the most conservative and backwards and regressive organizations in the world at the same time. The fact that we can have such liberation movements and such persecution movements be organized in the same space, I think some would think of as beautiful, but at the same time, it leads to a lot of our conflict and issues. So especially when you leave power to specific states, again, the more rural, the more conservative, the more religious that it is organized, you can have massive oppression of people that don't identify with the majority religion. And yet overall in this country, as you move state to state, you generally have federal protection. So it's this weird tension, I think we feel, but you, I think, are onto a good point that the culture, at least, has stayed more religious, and that is let religious organizations have more power culturally, maybe, because there wasn't, the government kept such a far distance from religion in our country in most cases, which means the government wasn't doing religious oppression in the same ways, but it meant religion can kind of create its own space and power on its own. It can own its own TV networks, and it's done some really good organizing, frankly.
Yeah, it was. I was thinking when you were talking earlier about how religious communities will train their leaders, and there's obviously I don't know how many millions, billions of dollar industry religion would be around the world.
It's got to be trillions. I think it's got to be over $1 trillion, personally, if I think of all religions put together.
Yeah, it must be. I mean, there's always these things you see, pastor such and such with his private jet and his, luxury mansion. But it was also interesting, and a kind of sad reflection is of what you said, that there's a handful of people around the world who are lucky enough to have a position like ours, where you're a professional humanist. It's
Right.
sadly a tiny number of people. And I think it is kind of incumbent on us to find ways to bring more people forward. One of the ways that I've always, when I worked in previous things, is you have like internship programs or graduate programs where,
Yeah.
you want to get people involved in a particular ethical issue or something, and then, kind of build this grassroots so you've got people who can take over in the future and things. And I guess the issue is that around the world for humanism, we just don't have the resources for that at the moment.
And that's a really interesting question of why. I think I can only speak for the United States, and I actually think this is a question for you: is how other groups think about fundraising in this space
Mm,
or resource development and what their long-term vision is. But in the United States, there's definitely this cultural issue where most of our members of a lot of our communities, I like to think of as recovering from religion.
yeah.
They come to us because they were traumatized and they were hurt or they felt lied to for years and years and years. A lot of these religious communities, they took their money and didn't use it in ethical ways. They had pastors or priests that were involved in unethical things. And just overall, they felt lied to about these answers of the universe. They felt like they weren't helped. They were pigeonholed. And so at least a lot of the ex-religious people that join our community, there's a lot of suffering and trauma attached to it. And so at least for that first 4 to 5 years they're involved in the community, they're frankly triggered by a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
Some people cannot stand when suddenly there's groups of people singing together in a secular space because it brings them back to church. If you take a bucket or a hat or something and pass it around asking for money, they go, whoa, 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 I didn't sign up for that. And I think this might be a larger cultural issue, at least of the skepticism movement. We've focused so much vitriol towards religious ideology and religious institutions as a whole that there's a sense that we have to throw absolutely everything out that came from those religious traditions because the beliefs were so toxic or the leaders were so toxic. And so I often see is a lot of our ex-religious people have kind of this period of time where it takes them a while to become more comfortable knowing that we can reorganize in a secular way in frankly very similar models as most religious communities. Atheists United, we meet on Sundays. We have a speaker that gets on stage. We do coffee and donuts afterwards. I mean, it looks like a lot of churches in the United States, frankly. But the content's different, the discussion's different, the expectations are different. But raising money is so different. I
Mm-hmm.
can't ask you to tithe 10% of your income like the Mormons do here. I would be shouted off stage if I tried to do that in an
And we can't
atheist.
sell immortality either.
And we definitely can't sell immortality. But I think this is a cultural shift we can and will make. I think of it more from a sales perspective is we need to show people the meaning and value of what we're doing. I truly believe that we can and will build better community models and institutions than what exists. And unless government is going to fill all of those spaces, which some of us also question if they should, but regardless, if they're not going to pick up all of these areas of societal needs, and there's some that just government can't, which might be existential questions, which might be
Mm-hmm.
culturally how you raise your children, it might be the rituals you find valuable, then we're going to have some institutions. We're going to have some community models that function in that space. And I think we just need to continue to show value in people's lives. People in our communities have no problem giving to charity. We find that they're very generous. But giving to an atheist charity, we need to sell the value of giving to a
Yeah.
humanist cause that's not just passed through to fighting the wildfires in California or an education program in the Philippines. Like, we're actually finding it hard to say, like, no, we should invest in local speakers, local coffee meetups, local community service, that we matter and community is valuable in and of itself. And I like to think there was some research done a while back that basically showed, I believe it was a United States study, that showed religious people, when you compared them to non-religious people, they gave more to charity, they volunteered more, they reported higher levels of happiness, and they were healthier. overall. But when you dug into the study, it had nothing to do with how intense their belief was. It's how often they went to a congregation or a place of worship. So basically, pro-social behavior has all these incredible benefits to you as a human being. And I'm
Yeah.
trying to wake up organizers, thought leaders, and our local community leaders to recognize that even if that's all we do, even if we have no larger, awesome humanist ideas behind us, which we do, even if we're not going to offer some life-changing program like a recovery program or help an education program for your kids, even if we didn't do all of that stuff, even if all we did was gather, let's say once a week or once a month, we're adding value to your life and our
Mm-hmm.
life for organizing it. Like there is value in and of itself of just the concept of community.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, as humanists, I think we want to do more. And frankly, we have the best method I think humans have come up with for like answering and taking on ethical questions and scientific questions. But yeah, we need to start from the place that community is good in and of
Yeah. Yeah.
itself.
Yeah.
And then the second step is that we actually have novel answers and solutions to some of the toughest questions in the world. You know, if
Yeah.
you want to figure out how to solve safe artificial intelligence someday, if you want to fight climate change, if you want to know how to deal with an economy where artificial intelligence is taking all the jobs, if like, we need
Yeah.
humanists at the
Yeah.
tables for these.
Absolutely.
We need the
Absolutely.
humanist method for solving ethical questions more than ever.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. I was thinking as well recently about these type of things because there was that there was a report in the news that they had found potential evidence of microscopic life on, is it Saturn or something? I forget
Cool.
the planet.
Okay.
But anyway, and I was just thinking, okay, well, that's as an existential question and an ethical
Right.
question, that's huge. Like, the possibility of alien life, and how can you make sense of that from an ethical point of view? Well, it has to be a humanist one. You can't.
Yeah. Well, and I think why we have a leg up in ethical conversations is how humble our method for thinking is. Like the scientific method, it asks you to always uh, take inputs of new information, and we're always saying what is the best available information, and then how do we use that to modify and update our beliefs. It is never a static belief system. And that is, to me, what makes humanism so thrilling and important to the world, is that we will learn from our mistakes and we will always continue to improve upon it. And this is why, like, if we could infuse humanism into everything, they all would get better. I think about education systems, I think about economic systems, I think about healthcare systems. Honestly, we need humanist method. I keep using the language method because I think it's critical. A lot of people, especially when critiquing us and our beliefs and identity, they're saying, science is a belief, like it's a finished concept, or
Mm-hmm.
humanism is this, it's just another religion. It's just this finished idea about the world, like we have a book or something. And we don't. We have a pencil and paper and are constantly updating based on new information. And we're always, like science, trying to falsify and fight back the worst ideas we have. So it's, to me, the only and the most critical answer for solving the biggest problems. And I don't know, frankly, how you solve
No.
the big problems, especially the existential problems,
Yeah.
without that. I mean, how we would, I used to say how we would organize for a pandemic. Here we are now, but
Yeah. Badly,
but
the answer
let's
was.
yeah, badly is the answer. Yeah, I like a humanist mindset is radically important in times like these. Like we need to understand and value the best science of today. We need to adjust based on new information. We need to prioritize human life and center human connection in those. You can't talk about a pandemic and pretend that you are a complete individual and have no impact on society and those around you. Like that, a pandemic should prove more than anything that that's
Mm.
impossible. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
you can't take 7 billion people and put them all in separate parts of the woods and have them live completely not connected lives.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's interesting what you were saying earlier on about the need for a community, because I think for a lot of people, I don't know what the restrictions are like where you are, but I know that a lot of us around the world, there's been various levels of lockdowns or,
Sure.
curfews, different things. So people have been a lot more isolated, even within
Hmm.
their own families or homes or whatever. And I think it's given us an understanding of the need for community. And also, I think
Yeah.
one of the reflections I have had is, um, what's it like for those of us who have that kind of existence generally? So I'm thinking, for example, of older people.
Yeah.
There was a statistic I heard of how many older people go through a day without talking to another person, and it
Wow.
just made me feel so sad because I've had a few days during the lockdown where you get a bit, you feel a bit down. You're missing the normal activity of
Yeah.
life and so on, and you think, God, imagine you've got older folk there with no visitors, for days, potentially weeks on end. I think it's been a bit of
Yeah.
a
And
humbling
I have to
reflection.
imagine this is more common in Western countries like ours, but
Mm,
yeah, it's a huge problem. I think about isolation constantly now. It's fun to have our emotions so educated over the past few months,
mm,
what that's like. But to then empathize with all of those around the world and thinking about solutions to that, yeah, to me, it's just another argument. We need humanism everywhere, all the
yeah,
time,
absolutely.
and we need institutions that can support it. I really think about if we're kind of this trailblazing group of the first paid organizers in this space, like what are the people that are going to come behind us going to build, and how do we make it so they're the best leaders and they have access to the resources they need? I think about my friends who have tried to make podcasts in this space or have tried to build their own communities, and we're starting from nothing most of the
Yeah,
time.
yeah.
We're talking about you're the only one in the area, and you are fundraising your first amount of funds to get the idea off the ground, and often it doesn't make it. Um, where if you were trying to start a new Lutheran church in the United States, you have this network with
Mm,
millions of dollars and thousands of people, and you would just immediately be a part of that. And I want us to build similar institutions where if you're in a rural or less organized part of the United States or anywhere, you can call up a Humanist International, you can call up an Atheists United, and we would be able to go, oh yeah, we've been doing this for 20 years. Here's what we've learned. And here's some starting resources.
hmm.
And you're not alone. Like, I think this is how we exponentially grow what I think's been slowly building for decades now. I do think there's a point where we will start going up an exponential curve. Fascinating to think when that might come, but we're
Yeah,
working.
yeah. That's interesting. And maybe just thinking about in terms of the kind of organizational thing, it might be interesting just for non-US people to get a sense of like
Sure.
how is the humanist movement across the US sort of set up. So I know, for example, we obviously have there's three national organizations which are members of Humanist International. We've got American Ethical Union, American Humanist Association, American Atheists, and then
Yep.
there's also this group which I think has a kind of coordinating role called Secular Coalition for America.
Yes.
So does that all kind of work?
Yeah. So if we were to back up about 40 years, I think there would be about three or four national organizations. And three of them are the ones you just mentioned. It would be American Ethical Union, it'd be American Human Association, and American Atheists. And American Atheist historically was always much more aggressive. It focused on media, but was separation of church and state minded. There was American Humanist Association, which kind of balanced cultural and legal, but had a huge cultural focus. It attracted and worked with a lot of thought leaders across the United States, gave awards to Isaac Asimov and Carl Sagan and I think Gloria Steinem, like these wonderful kind of progressive heroes. And then American Ethical Union, which is frankly a humanist religious model. They came out of kind of a Jewish agnostic tradition and created, I think, one of the most successful secular religious models possibly in world history. Um, and then, especially over the past 25 years, I think, you started to see this explosion of other groups. So Freedom from Religion Foundation is actually the largest group in the United States today, and they are extremely legal focused. As their name points to, they're all about separation of government and religion. And they have a team of lawyers. I think they have over 30 staff now. They're a huge organization. And they're focusing on state and national laws all across the United States. The Secular Student Alliance and Center for Inquiry. So Center for Inquiry is kind of an international organization. I don't know. I can't speak to all of them. I'll be here all day, actually, if I'm realizing if I try to describe all of them. But Secular Coalition for America is about 20 years old now, maybe 15 years old. And that is the one that brought all of these groups together. So most of these groups used to function very independently, often clashed with each other. We used to joke about the label wars where humanists and atheists, couldn't get through a conversation without fighting over which is better. And
I remember the tail end of that, I think, or at least at some point, there was always big rants about which was the best word.
Yeah, and I'm so happy I showed up after most of that was dying down. And, we'll throw the skeptics in there. There was a Bright movement for a little bit.
I remember that as well.
So there's always been these clashes over labels, and a lot of the thought leaders and organization leaders at the time made that a lot worse. They were very territorial about the thing they were promoting and working on, which makes sense. And I like to think of it very meta, from a meta level of this organizational development of a movement. We're trying to find our language. We're a very new, young movement. We're in our first 50 to 100 years, and we're fighting over labels because we don't know the answer yet. Which one's going to take off and be successful for us? This is very reminiscent of a lot of other social movements, from the feminist movement or LGBT movement or civil rights movements. Language is one of your earliest and most important inter-movement fight you have. But eventually they started to organize together, and they founded the Secular Coalition for America, which was designed to be our lobbyist organization in Washington, D.C. We found that a lot of these organizations overlapped on mission and membership by 80 to 90%. Maybe we can all agree to fund a lobbyist that can represent all of us and actually aim for federal government. And that was the first, I believe, federal lobbyist for the movement. And from there, they've all worked together really well. They started meeting together once a year, and all of these executive directors now work very closely. And fast forward to today, and most of these organizations have their own lobbyists in DC that all coordinate together. So we now have a team of about 4 or 5 lobbyists in Washington, DC. We have the legal teams of all of these larger organizations working together. And some of the biggest national organizations in the United States have staffs of 5 to 20 people. So we have a very fast-growing, large institutional movement now in the United States. And you're kind of seeing even focused groups under that label. So the Secular Student Alliance, which got started 20 years ago, focused on students on college campuses and high schools. Black Nonbelievers focuses on Black and African American people in America. We have the Hispanic American Freethinkers, which focuses on the Latinx community across the United States. And we have Ex-Muslims of North America, which is one of the fastest growing, I think, organizations in the United States as well right now. And you have now this continued mobilization of different focus areas. You have a few much larger, widespread organizations that cover multiple causes. And then you have, in a few states, large organizations like us that are trying to level up and hire our first staff and mobilize in multiple cities, or take our programming from all free speakers and top out at about 50 to 100 people and try to actually have more cultural impact, maybe on the governments or the local cultures or community institutions locally. It's very fascinating. I think, most of us hate the George W. Bush administration and how much religion that brought into government, the rise of the religious right in general. But it helped inspire and bring new funding and new leaders and new organizations to our movement that has been kind of energized ever since.
Mm.
We're seeing a new energy in response to the Trump administration, obviously. Mike Pence, as vice president, comes directly from the religious right movement in the United States. And if they complete what sure looks like a coup here in the United States, we are going to be in the Handmaid's Tale for sure.
Goodness. Well, that's a bit bleak. But
so,
an exciting time, I
hope.
guess, for the movement in terms of it sounds like there's a lot of bubbling activity and enthusiasm.
Politically, our work is feeling higher and higher stakes. So it's fascinating thinking about raising money and organizing during this time, because there's a lot of communities that feel persecution by the Trump administration, that feel scared. There seems to be some level of right-wing militias, whether we want to call them that or not, being organized in the United States right now, that are starting to attack protest movements like Black Lives Matter. And I'm trying to wake up my community to the fact that if they gain power again, and if this continues to grow, which even if they don't gain power might still continue to grow, we're high on the list of people that will be attacked. Atheists often aren't the last ones they go after. We have a lot of intellectuals in our communities. We are challenging the Christian nationalism that a lot of these groups identify with, and we are one of their largest threats. The Attorney General of the United States, Bill Barr, recently said that basically our concept of separation of church and state has been, I forget the language he used, but infected or something like that by secularists and their radical movement. Like, they are starting to communicate even how we are corrupting what will eventually be called God's law. And so secular law is being challenged in parts of the United States, even by the lead legal authority of the United States right now.
And I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but it seems like on this issue that there's just a very clear answer. I visited 2017. I visited the AHA's new office in DC, beautiful building, and one of the staff there gave me a gift, which was a copy of the Constitution of the US, but it also included a list of papers called the Federalist Papers, which I wasn't actually familiar with before, and I've read a few of them since, and these are basically the writings which framed the Constitution, and some letters to the delegates who voted for the original Constitution, and kind of some of the thoughts of like Jefferson and so on.
The best way to learn about this is go watch Hamilton. If you haven't seen the show Hamilton yet, it's on Disney Plus. Download it illegally or something. But there's a whole song actually that talks about Hamilton wrote over half of those Federalist Papers. But there was this problem after the Constitution was passed in the United States where they didn't know how to get the public to back it. And so the writers and framers, they tried to get some of the best founders of the country at the time to put all these public letters out. Hamilton wound up writing 50 of the 70 Federalist Papers that went out into local newspapers across the United States, the early, very young, fragile United States at the time. To this day, they're used as kind of the backbone of legal thought when there's questions about what the founders meant for the Constitution. So yes, from that perspective, if we are to stick to a rational law theory and a secular concept of it based on how the founders intended it, sure. I would think the backbone of our separation of church and state is solid. It's probably become world news now that we are having a fight over the next Supreme Court justice in the United States.
Yeah.
So we just had... we just lost one of our longest serving Supreme Court justices who was a consistent liberal on the court. And the person that was put forward has had connections to the religious right for a long period of time, has basically had public quotes about questioning elements of secular law. Amy something Bennett, I think. And I really think a lot of the conversations, she's smart enough to get through the hearings and not say anything too problematic. we're finding that Trump appointments to the court have been very savvy in how they get through Senate confirmations. But no, I'm terrified. Abortion, which has been legal in the United States since the 1970s, will probably be overturned by this court if she's put on it. And the reasons are religious. There's only a few religious traditions that are opposed to abortion, and they want to prioritize that belief over all other people's beliefs in the United States.
I was actually just looking at her Wikipedia page as you were talking there, and I looked at it before because I was interested in this. It ties in with something you said earlier, which was about the great diversity of religious movements across the US, because I was trying to read into like what her religious affiliation was, and it's like a paragraph to try and describe it. It's something to do with interdenominational charismatic Christian parachurch community, people of praise. I don't know what any of that means, but
my understanding from what I've read so far is people of praise is a more focused kind of subgroup of a charismatic tradition. I mean, this is all different forms of evangelical in my mind in the United States, which is also a broad, loose word. We found that a lot of these really, really conservative traditionalist churches that are Protestant are affiliating less and less with larger networks. They do politically. They are very well organized politically, but at least in how they organize, they call themselves non-denominational.
I see.
And what that often means is the pastor has full control over the place. There's no larger institution like a lot of Lutheran churches or Baptist churches even that are connected to a larger network. And there's, like Catholics have a very strict structure for how things move through. And even some Protestant traditions like Anglican have very strict structures for how ideas move down from the top.
Yes.
And even if there's some democratic process to get up to leadership, like it still comes down from the top. These evangelical, non-denominational, I forget what denomination did she call it? Interdenominational.
That was only the introductory paragraph, sentence. I mean, there's a whole paragraph on her religious views.
And we have to think back to the Billy Grahams and Jerry Falwells. Like that's the tradition in the United States. 50 to 100 years ago, they were organizing tent revivals back in the day. It'd be a pastor who would start their own church in a rural area, and they'd put up a tent, and thousands of people would turn out. And that's just become this really successful model in the United States. At the peak, you have mega churches, which have their own TV networks,
which is just a really bizarre concept in my mind. I was raised, my family, I'm from Scotland. My family are sort of half Irish, half Scottish, and I was raised Catholic. And so, like, the idea of a mega church, the idea of of playing a guitar during a
you should if you're ever out here again, I should take you to one. It's an experience because it feels like a rock concert. When I ran my group at California Lutheran University, we kind of functioned like the interfaith club on campus. A lot of the people who weren't sure what their religion was came to us, and we decided to do all these adventures to different religious communities. And I've kind of kept up with that a little bit since. And there's a few mega churches in California. And I went to one that had, I think, 4,000 or 5,000 people in attendance. And you walk in and it just feels like a concert venue. They've got, 5 to 10 staff working lighting and sound. You've got definitely a professional band that gets paid to do that every day. And these are incredible singers and performers. And then, it's so choreographed, and the lighting. I mean, even smoke came on at one point on stage, and the little videos they play, it's unbelievable. But I should read some more books on how that tradition became so successful. I think it plays into a lot of psyche and entertainment for people. But what I have read about those groups that I'm hoping we can replicate better in secular community models is, while they are big entertainment focused, almost like a football game, it's really actually about the small groups. So when you sign up and get involved, they put you in groups of about 12 people, and those people become your family. They often actually have a sub community that you meet with weekly or daily, and that's your Bible school, or that's your connection. And so while it's huge, you're actually put into very, very, very small, focused community.
That's
And then
interesting,
you're larger than yourself.
because that feeds into something you were saying earlier about sort of like sophisticated communications and things like that, and campaigns and stuff. And actually, I wanted to mention at the beginning, one of the reasons that we got to know each other, which I'm going to just share this screen again if I can figure it. Okay, here we go. So you got in touch, you and your colleagues got in touch with me and the staff at Humanist International in April, after the very sad incident of Mubarak Bala's kidnapping at the time, subsequent detention, and got in touch with us to help us out with essentially that, communications campaigns. And one of the things you did was set up this lovely website, freemubarakbala.org. And it was quite an interesting process for me, because as I said to you at the time, Humanist International being this kind of umbrella body, we've always been very sensitive to not want to sort of step on the toes of our national members. And also, we're a small team of staff, and we focus on areas where we have expertise at the UN and international forums and stuff. So when we were met with this kind of mass of people on social media and in real life who wanted to get involved, because Mubarak Bala, of course, was a very well-known member of the humanist community, who wanted to get in touch and who wanted to get involved and do something to help. We were kind of stuck because we're used to working on sort of briefing papers and whatever. So that was our first sort of how we got to know each other and our collaboration, which was very interesting for me. But I wonder if there's maybe something like, there's probably an interesting reflection there for maybe the wider movement about thinking about how we do our communications, our campaigns, our engagement with people.
Well, and this is thinking about movements, which is just the book I got to write someday. I'm kind of obsessed with this like concept of trying to process movements and where ours is at and where it goes. But you need professionals. I really think for you to take it to the next level, you need professionals, and you need better and better professionals. And that will help us build more professional institutions, which will raise more money, which will make our impact larger. And when I got started as a student leader, there were very few professionals out there, and I certainly wasn't a professional. I was young and trying to figure out what to do. And after college, I started my own company. I thought I was going to go into social justice, like local facilitation and trainings. And I wound up joining a political campaign a few years ago, and I got a crash course in media, frankly. My business partner and I, Sarah, who you've met, we ran a congressional campaign in the United States. We ran the only open atheist for national office in the United States in 2014. Wow. And we knew we couldn't win the race. It was just one of those super Republican districts, and we were running a long shot Democrat. So we decided we would run it like a media campaign and focus on culture and engagement. We were going to make it known that atheists are running for office in the United States, and we're going to normalize it. And so we did everything we could to get attention that was positive and productive for him and his political stances, and didn't actually focus on electoral politics the way most people did. And it just gave us this 9-month masterclass in how to do publicity, how to professionalize our work. I had done quite a bit of graphic design at that point, but I had, doubled that amount of work in just this 9-month period. I became incredibly skilled in a short period of time on graphic design. And we made national news, I think 3 or 4 times on that campaign. We went viral twice over some publicity stunts we did. And when that ended, we said, let's go into business together and try to start the first humanist PR firm in the United States. And we realized very quickly we were the only ones doing it. There was a few staff on national organizations that did PR and media, and most of them weren't very experienced. And in just a few years' time, you kind of look around, and because our movement's so small and there's so few resources, because we're not headhunting from other movements right now. We don't have the resources to go grab someone from McDonald's PR team. We kind of got ourselves into a position where we are trained in PR now. And I it's funny because in the big scheme of things, like I'm not very trained. I feel very self-taught. We had to figure it out on our own. I went to school for communications, but this feels very different at times. Where I'm sure there's going to be someone like Sarah Henry, who we worked with, who studied communications, who's got a job in PR right out of college, who had been working on national news stories for years, and she's in her young 20s, right? Like she's actually more trained in PR and going to take it to a whole other level. But we need people to experiment and become professionals in different fields. And media is one of those. Government is an area of those. Organizing, this is an area we have not been putting enough resources into. If you think of political movements, there are professional organizers. You are trained on how to communicate with people at the grassroots, on how to mobilize groups of people at the grassroots, how to continue to communicate and mobilize those people, how to coalition build. These are skills that get honed. And I had to step outside of our movement to learn some, I tried to keep one foot in it as much as possible, but I had to go into politics to learn it. And then now I've come back and I'm trying to use it more. But we need more people like this. And
Yeah.
eventually we'll get to the point where we have professional fundraisers and we're going to then use that money to headhunt. I think the LGBT movement in the United States, at least, and I'm sure in parts of the world, it seems like they hit this massive growth point over the past 20, 30 years. And it feels like that's when their staffs professionalized to a whole other level and their resources went up to a whole other level. And I think they often move together.
Yeah.
And we're in that point where we're starting to hire professionals, people like you who studied law and government and, uh, the clash of secular law around the world and blasphemy, are a professional. You studied this and can now run an organization that prioritizes that. Is so much better than what they would have been able to get 20 years ago, who was probably just some volunteer who was working in math and geology, but had the time. No offense to those people. They did
No,
great
I'm sure
pioneering
your
work.
board will be my board will
But
be very happy to hear that.
but this is good. Like we're
Yeah, no,
doing
yeah, yeah,
great
yeah.
work. So
And
yeah.
I think you're right. I mean, in every other domain of life, we see specialism and specialization as progress.
Yeah.
That we will get people who are specialized on that task. So I think you're absolutely
So with that said, if you're watching and you have 50,000 pounds, you need to give
right.
them to Gary right
Absolutely,
now so he
absolutely.
can hire some PR people and he can hire some organizers, so he can be really good at what he's good at and not have to do 100 things that he wasn't trained at as well.
That would be ideal, please. Now, you mentioned politics there, and I wondered maybe if you, I think it's interesting, right? So again, this is my perspective as a European, although, well, British,
Sure.
I don't know, British/European. I'm British and European because I'm also Irish. But anyway, um, American politics, or at least whatever we see in Europe, I don't know how much of the
Yeah.
news which is filtered through our media is the same, and it's probably the same for people around the world outside of the US. As you know, the US has this dominant role in political and cultural life around the world.
Yeah.
So, for example, I'll be listening to a podcast, a British podcast, and the adverts will be telling me to register for the presidential elections here in
Great.
Britain. It's
Great.
just
Good.
all these just
I wish
constant,
you could.
well, me too. There's all these constant reminders of American politics all the time, and
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure you can imagine what kind of understanding I have of it looking from afar, but tell us what you think is going on, and the indications that we seem to be seeing is that some of the polls look to be showing that you're going to have a new president in the autumn. Maybe you could just give us what's your perspective, or
Yeah.
what's a humanistic perspective, because the other thing I
Sure.
saw yesterday was from the Friendly Atheist on Twitter that there was a new group, Humanists for Joe Biden.
Yeah.
So there's
So
a
I can
whole
speak
lot
to
there. I wonder what you
all of those. There's a lot there.
yeah. American politics in a nutshell, please.
Yeah. Oh, okay. No problem. I think if I had another hour, we could break down the possibly failed empire that is the United States today, or crashing superpower. But I'll focus more on humanist community, humanist organizing, and how we're kind of reacting to this election. So we have a very two-party run system here in the United States. Trump is the current president, represents the Republicans, and Joe Biden, who's the former vice president under Barack Obama, is the Democratic nominee right now. And he is polling much better than Donald Trump nationally, but we don't have a normal election system in the United States. So crash course on US politics, we have something called an electoral college, which takes the popular vote of each state and then awards them the amount of seats they have in the House of Representatives, plus the seats they have in the Senate. And that is the total number you get from each state for winning that state. And you need 270 of those points in order to win. But there's a few places that don't quite get what maybe they should or aren't represented right, such as Washington, D.C. or Puerto Rico, which are territories.
Washington, D.C., which has the motto of taxation without representation.
Without representation, yes. And if we want to get very technical, they also have a larger population than like 5 states. There's 3 million people in Washington, D.C.
Wow.
People don't realize the scale of Washington, D.C., which is why a lot of us want statehood for Washington, D.C. 1, they'll have representation. 2, they already represent so many people and yet can only get 3 electoral college votes, or 1, I forget. They have to get less than the same as the smallest state in the nation, even though they're larger than a lot of the state. Anyways, super complicated. We have an electoral college system, so you actually just need to win a bunch of swing states. And we have, I don't know, about 13 swing states now in the United States that you're probably hearing all about if you follow American politics, like Pennsylvania and Florida and Wisconsin. Joe Biden's doing really well in polling in all of them. But I don't actually want to focus on that as much. We're going to find out what happens over the next few months. We have a few complicated things about our democracy in general that's about to happen. So 1, Donald Trump and the Republican Party are doing a lot to undermine what is the traditional process. So they're putting a lot of doubt into mail-in ballots, which is something most states have moved to over the past 20 years, and almost all states have had to consider and investive since the pandemic happened. Going to your polling place and voting is not safe the way it used to be. And sitting in those lines, which they often are long lines because of how poorly run our elections are in a lot of places, is just dangerous. And so the best solution is mail-in ballots. And there's a recognition that would help young people, poor people, people of color, and people with disabilities, which overwhelmingly vote more for Democrats. And so Republicans are building doubt and confusion about those right now. They're also, oh my God, I'm trying to see how in depth we want to go. There's a few other technical laws that we used to have civil rights protections that basically stopped organizing around polling places that got repealed recently. So we're also going to see possibly right-wing militias showing up at some polling places in the United States that were not allowed to do that in the past. And there seems to be the Republicans organizing that. There seems to be different legal challenges that are going to be made because normally American elections are able to be called on election night. But when you have mail-in votes, it takes a lot longer to count them. And so if a lot of Republicans vote day of, and a lot of Democrats will vote by mail, they will try to stop the election if Trump's ahead in some of those areas. And there will be legal battles. This is technically how George W. Bush won against Gore in Florida in 2000. Is actually they stopped the counting of ballots. Gore would have won Florida. It's really complicated. But
it's a very strange. And the other thing I've heard is that there's a concern that, even if you sort of take the legal and technical aspects away, that, Donald Trump could just declare that he has won. And
yes. And so let's get there in a second. There's all of these technical problems we have, and you're seeing lawyers on both sides kind of get ready for a huge legal battle. The bigger problems are if what I think could happen is essentially a coup. If you have the Republicans refusing to leave office, even if it's obvious that they have lost the election. They will put massive doubt into the election, and I don't think there's anyone in the world who thinks Trump will just go away quietly.
Mm.
We're too rational to think that will happen. So we have this situation where we could have a broken democracy essentially in the United States, and we don't have the same legal protections that some other countries do that kind of dictate this process. There's a lot of really gray language in the law. And so I've heard people prepping for the House of Representatives could decide this, and Nancy Pelosi could become the next president.
Yeah, I've seen some of the flow charts that try to sort of predict things.
And so let's not even focus on that, though. I think the much bigger problems for democracy in the United States, regardless of who wins the election, is one, we have the internet and the Republican Party, and especially Donald Trump, have organized a new group of white nationalists, Christian nationalists that feel inspired to organize very publicly in a way they never have before, and they carry weapons. And we're seeing this starting to organize and counter-protest of the Black Lives Matter movement, the strongest right now. It's kind of a reaction to the modern civil rights movement we have in the United States. And we're starting to see more language from the religious right question secular law. And I feel like there's kind of a power struggle. So if Donald Trump wins, this country gets very dangerous very quickly because they have full power over the federal government. If they were to lose the Senate, then there's some options to limit his power, but then we have the Supreme Court. We're getting very complicated in U.S. politics, but essentially, I do think culturally we have a new breed of right-wing terrorists that will be a part of our culture we're going to have to deal with. And we're already starting to see of this. We recently had a shooter show up at a Black Lives Matter rally and kill 2 protesters, 17-year-old who just showed up with his mother's gun.
This is the person with the rifle? Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I saw some images of that. I mean, it looks just, I guess, here in Britain, we're not used to seeing guns. I mean, you might see somebody with a shotgun in the countryside very rarely, but the amount of weapons that seem to be in some aspects of public life is just...
We have, I think it's over 9 guns per American across the United States.
Wow.
So we are extremely armed. And we're seeing the left is starting to buy guns at much higher rates as well. I mean, there are many theorists who think we are on the verge of a civil war, and we have all of the ingredients for a second civil war in the United States. And again, regardless, I think we're less stable if Trump wins. We're unstable regardless, though. I think you have a mobilized right-wing, especially white nationalist and Christian nationalist movement that does not want to get rid of power in any way, shape, or form. They won't control government the same, and so they will work as outside actors. If the Trump administration wins, then those people are in government, and they can continue to attack immigrants, to attack people that aren't Christian, to attack the transgender community. I mean, the level of attacks will have government and institutional support in ways that are kind of unfathomable to me. So both election outcomes will actually be dangerous. It just seems like we will have a more stable, hopefully, government under a Biden administration, which is a personal belief and stance, not Atheists United. So, yeah, I don't know. I think we're heading into unstable times regardless. We need humanist leadership and solutions. I think we are part of this larger pluralistic and multicultural movement happening in a lot of Western places across the world, frankly, just everywhere in the world right now. We understand our global connection and our global society, and there is backlash to that. There is traditionalist backlash politically by racists, by capitalists, there's quite a few groups that are kind of frustrated by this. And we just have to stay vigilant and organized and protect ourselves because it is not stable times, I think, for the future of the U.S. And while some liberal cities like Los Angeles will probably be a little steadier, I mean, who really knows? I was just reading that there's been over 100 car attacks on Black Lives Matter protesters across the United States, where cars drive into
Oh
protesters.
my goodness.
And like these are the type of terrorist attacks that I think are low level right now. The next level would be if they actually take assault rifles and start taking down protesters, or mobilize in certain neighborhoods and then shooting breaks out. We're not quite there yet, but when militias essentially show up at polling places, and we see Black Lives Matter continue to be the largest civil rights protests in world history happen every day on our streets, regardless of who's president, and you see these groups who feel like they're losing power. And this is all without even mentioning the conspiracy theories, the propaganda
Yes.
from Russia that is impacting our social media.
I
We have
happened.
something,
I don't think we want to unpack this, but if
QAnon.
any, yeah, I found out about this about a week ago. QAnon, and there's a whole Wikipedia article that people can read. I mean, if
There's
you
some polls that show 20% of Republicans believe in it too. So
wow,
forget angels being the like beliefs we used to critique back in the day. QAnon, for everyone listening, is this supposedly anonymous source in the hidden in the government as like the deep, keeping track of the deep state, they call it, which is a conspiracy theorist concept that's been around for 30 years. And it's basically spouting like Nazi propaganda type ideas and language. And I'm
and they
just,
seem to be suggesting that Donald Trump is battling a secret army of
yeah,
child-killing pedophiles that
yep.
kill children and somehow use a part of their insides to keep themselves living forever.
Yeah,
It's like
it's
sci-fi
nuts. It's like
nonsense.
lizard people type
Yeah.
concepts. Yeah. So
But
anyways,
it seems
we're
that
dealing with a lot.
yeah. Well,
So if 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 the election goes one way, maybe I'm coming out your way to live in your not European country. But
well, I mean, I could give you my views about UK politics.
no,
Don't seem
I
to be
know.
as bad, but yeah. I mean, well, the interesting thing I think for me, Humanists International has, at least the time being, adopted a home working policy. So some
Yeah,
of our staff, including me, who are here in London, will be allowed to roam free, and we're going to be more digital for a while. So next year, I'll go back and spend some time in Glasgow. Next year, we will probably have the second Scottish independence referendum.
yeah. You think it'll
And
go through now?
I
It
don't
was
know.
close
It
last
was
time.
close last time, and a majority of people in Scotland support the European Union, and obviously now we're being taken out of it. I think there's a big
Yeah,
dimension there. But anyway, I mean, it's politics on a completely different league from what's happening in the US, but interesting times ahead nonetheless.
yeah.
But what about this campaign that I saw, the Humanists for Biden campaign? Is that,
Oh, let me go over that real quick.
yeah.
So, as long as I've been alive, there's never been an organized subgroup of non-religious, secular, humanist people who kind of have a sub-identity in the campaign. So a lot of these national campaigns for president often have a African Americans for Biden, or Christians for Clinton, or Muslims for Kerry, or name your presidential candidate. And they often have kind of leadership structure that then can report their issues and mobilize their community for those campaigns. And Biden's campaign just announced, I think yesterday, that there is now a Humanist for Biden kind of subcommittee inside his
Oh,
campaign that is recruiting and promoting humanist people. And so with I think Greg Epstein at Humanist Community at Harvard, and Sarah Levin, who recently organized Secular Democrats as a new organization in the US. They have established this as an official kind of subgroup of the Biden campaign. And they put out this beautiful video that was supercut of a lot of humanist leaders across the United States giving their endorsement for Biden and why they are voting for him. And they are now going to do a fundraising party on Thursday, and going to continue to push kind of their humanist community's support of that candidate. And I know there have been conversations possibly with other campaigns like Clinton last cycle, But this is the first time it's happened in a presidential campaign, and is quite thrilling. To me, it
Yeah.
shows how organized we finally are.
And that's interesting because to go back to what we started talking about, it shows, I guess, that for Joe Biden or his campaign, that he recognizes that there's a large winnable constituency there for him. Is
I
that
think
would that
so.
be a way to
I think
interpret
that's
it?
the idea. I've from 2014, when we ran the only open atheist for national office, to today, I'm generally frustrated with how much the parties take for granted the not religious identifying population, which is now almost 30% of the American public that don't identify with religion. They're not necessarily atheist, agnostic, or humanist, but they don't identify with religion. And when you actually look at the beliefs, the political beliefs of that group, they actually are more tightly aligned than even the religious right in some cases,
Interesting.
which was recent data that came out. I think we used to talk about ourselves as this super diverse, not politically aligned group. And we actually find that the less religious people are, the more they agree on a number of issues. And so it might be one of the most reliable voting blocks for Democrats in the United States, but it's almost never catered to.
Wow.
They focus a lot of their language and attention on religious communities, specifically Christian communities in the United States. And so this is, I think, a really big deal that Biden's campaign is including us, essentially. And I hope that signals to other campaigns that we should have prominent organization roles,
Yeah.
that there are
Because
issues and
if you
language
have,
that you can speak to that
yeah,
will mobilize and interest our community. But I mean, I remember 2014, we had a humanist fundraiser, and it was, I think, the first humanist fundraiser for a campaign in the country.
wow,
And that's it, just to see how far we've come is quite
yeah.
exciting.
And it would be amazing to think that in 2024 or whenever the next cycle is, that you could have two presidential candidates fighting over the humanist vote. Imagine how amazing
It,
that would be.
it's yeah,
I mean,
not yet.
maybe
We're
I'm being
definitely not there yet.
optimistic there,
Yeah,
but
yeah, yeah. I mean,
I presume
uh,
obviously as well that there's no similar thing on the Trump side of things.
yeah. So the polling data is not very strong for. It's still larger than you would think on the Republican Party affiliation. It's way more Christian, and it's way more religiously diverse on the Democratic side, and it's way more kind of evangelical and Catholic on the conservative Republican side. But there still is, 5 to 10%. That's still like a large number of people that identify not as religious, but they're definitely not catered to over there.
That's interesting. But
Yeah,
there's
and
no
even the
similar
party
official
platforms.
campaign in terms of like a Humanists for Trump thing or anything. There's nothing like that, I presume.
Uh, there's a um, there's a organization called I think Republican Atheists, organized by a woman who's in Europe, I believe.
Oh,
Um, and they don't work well with any of the groups I know of. Mostly because she attacks us for all of the beliefs we organize as our communities.
interesting.
But so yeah, it does seem like there's a huge value divide for most of us that identify as humanists. There is nothing that the Republican Party is doing that we can issue a line with right now, and they
Hmm.
are the organizers of the attacks against us often. But there are some out there who identify as Trump supporting atheists or um, atheist Republicans in the United States. There's a new, smaller organization that got organized, but again, the value alignment. I
Hmm.
organize more around values than identity, and some of these groups that organize around political identity, we have to decide if our values align. And I do not feel almost any value alignment with these conservative or liberty focused
Yeah.
atheist organizations.
And I suppose it would be hard as well, even, say for example, those humanists who maybe have conservative economical views or whatever,
Mm-hmm,
but
mm-hmm.
I think it's fair to say most humanists, well, it seems obvious they would be progressive in terms of their social views. And when you seem to have a
Yeah,
US president at the moment who's very focused on social over
yeah.
economical things, so
And I do think that's
um,
fascinating. And we've, in a lot of ways, the humanist movement has not addressed where it is on economic issues. And
Yeah,
we, in a lot of ways, try to separate our social issues from our economic issues. And most economic theories don't. They
yeah,
recognize that there are like values attached. You know, if you read Marx, he's not talking about it in just numbers terms. He's
yeah,
talking about it in values terms.
yeah. That's interesting.
And I do think actually, if you look at more conservative or liberal views on economics, like we do have to start dipping our toes in the values conversations
Yeah,
about different economic models and where we align. While I think, especially some of us that run organizations, maybe have been like, we feel so small, we need broader bases, or our donor base is maybe more conservative than our membership base.
mm,
I sense that a lot of leaders in the past have actually avoided those conversations and said humanism's more about these social issues. But I think we are missing how there are many sub communities. When we think of the history of slavery in the United States, like you can't separate that from capitalism. And we need to have real conversations about capitalist impact on certain sub communities in the United States, and how that still impacts people to this day. You know, the
yeah, yeah,
exploitation of labor to me is a powerful conversation to have about values.
yeah.
And likewise, when we talk about government models and how large they are, like the largest genocides in American history have happened by governments, which is
Mm,
often a conservative argument for why we should have small governments. So to me, we can't sit out on those conversations, and yet we often do. So I think the next wave of humanist thought might actually be more connected to maybe some of our economic thought, and we will have strong political divides, and we will be having a little bit of label wars again over if you can be conservative or progressive and be humanist. Because I'm starting to understand more how, like, the history of slavery in the United States, at least for me, I don't see how it can be separated from the history of capitalism in the United States. And we should be having those conversations. And we're
mm.
often told like that's a political economic debate, like it doesn't impact people. And maybe humanism has a lot to say about that.
Yeah, that's interesting. A fascinating challenge there. Um, well, I think we're heading towards the end of our time. Is there anything you would like to say to the viewers of our video, from different humanist organizations around the world that we've not covered?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I really hope we can stay interconnected. I think the value of Humanist International, beyond its incredible direct aid work for those that are being attacked by their governments or in refugee situations, or whoever the next Mubarak Bala will be, um, is that it connects groups from countries across the world. It helps our ideas flow between countries. We're having a reckoning conversation in our group about how even our humanism has been so European and North American focused for the past 38 years we've been in existence, that we're missing a lot of the language and ideas that have come from Asia and Africa and the Middle East that are just as valuable, and sometimes are more interfaith or interact with different community thoughts that maybe are less capitalist or rationalist the way we often use that language. And yeah, I'm hopeful we all can learn from each other in that way. Um, and then, yeah, give Humanist International and Atheists United some money. We really want to keep doing this
Here,
work
here.
and growing this work. And I'm not going to ask you to tie 10% of your income, but I do.
20 or 30, I think.
But yeah, but I do wish I could challenge everyone to think about the impact you want to make on the future and
Mm,
how you can do that as an individual. And I do think coming up with some number, maybe trying to pledge 3% of your income or something. I would love to get to the point where we could get most atheists to rationally think about, rather than like through force and fiat, think like, oh, I want to give 1% of my income to a local organization and 1% to a national organization and maybe another 1% to an international organization, because I want to make an impact, because these groups make an impact. And I think Humanist International is making a big impact, and I think your local communities, whether they're well organized or not, might ultimately make the biggest impact. So I realize there's some really sexy national and international organizations you really want to give your money to, and I'm not saying don't give them anything, but don't forget the groups in your backyard that can actually really step up if you or someone locally is in crisis.
Wonderful. Well, Evan, thank you very much for that interesting overview and discussion. And yes, that was great. Thank you.